Right at this very second, as we are gathered here this morning, my existence and your existence is utterly dependent upon a tiny little, well, it's not so tiny, but a fairly tiny organ that is pacing in your body. I've forgotten how many times a minute, depending on what activity you're doing, but pushing the blood around your body that means you and I physically are alive. The heart is an incredibly wonderful organ. But the heart of your existence and my existence is not to be found in the fact that we are a most wonderful physical creation. We are more than the sum and the substance of the cells and the many other things that go to make up our physical being. The Christian faith is absolutely in no doubt that the heart of our existence is about relationship. 3 quick reasons, which we could spend a lot of time thinking about more, but 3 quick reasons. Why does the Christian faith proclaim that the heart of our existence, true existence, healthy existence, existence with purpose and meaning, why is it about a relationship? 1, because the God who made all things is spirit. He is a divine person. He exists in 3 persons in one, Father, Son, and Spirit. He has known the sweetness and the richness and the fullness of personal empowering relationships amongst the 3 persons of the Godhead, Father, Son, and Spirit. Second, the tragedy of our race is that we live throughout our life, and it affects everything we are and do from the very moment we're born into this world to the very end. We live with a broken relationship. A broken relationship with that God who is Father, Son, and Spirit, and therefore affects all that we are and all that we do. I can never know a true fulfillment in life until this broken relationship is restored. Third, there is the most wonderful of all persons who has come to bring that broken relationship back into union. And his name is Jesus Christ. And that's why I want us to spend a few weeks thinking about people who encountered Jesus. You see, we live in an age perhaps more than ever, don't we, when there is an incredible misunderstanding about what Christianity is and what Christianity has been. Let me put it in the negative. Christianity is never to be perceived as something that is simply a movement perhaps that is turned into an institution, or it's somehow a kind of an organization, or even more than this, it is not simply just another type of religion that the human race has known. No, at the very heart of the Christian faith is this call to know a personal God, to know the restoration of a personal relationship with him through this most glorious person, Jesus Christ. And that's why this morning I want to take you to a little place called Bethsaida, probably, and the passage isn't 100% clear, but probably somewhere, not in the town, but probably in the surrounding area, where this man called Nathanael encounters Jesus. Now, we don't know a great deal about Nathanael, okay? He's probably like a lot of people of his day. He had two names, like we often, John Woolley, name and surname, so often in Jesus' days, Simon Peter. And it's probably Nathanael is to be understood as the same person who was called Bartholomew. Because whenever you read the list of Jesus' apostles, it's always Philip and Bartholomew. It's Philip here who's engaged in bringing Nathanael, Bartholomew, to Jesus. So what is it that we want to see here that's so important? Well, let's begin by asking a simple question. Where do we find Nathanael as this little account opens? Where do we find Nathanael? Well, we're told, aren't we, that Philip, who has met Jesus, finds his friend Nathanael and says, look, we found, he calls him the one Moses spoke about, Jesus of Nazareth. That's a fascinating. We'll come back to that. He says to Nathanael, we found Jesus of Nazareth. We'll see why that's so fascinating in a minute. And, somewhat skeptical, Nathanael says, well, come on, Nazareth is a bit of a dead-end town. Come and see, he says. And so he comes. And when he comes to Jesus, the first thing that Jesus says to him, actually, he says, you were sitting under a fig tree. So in one sense, this passage, this little incident, it begins really, because it's reflecting back, isn't it, what's happened. It begins with Nathanael, when we first come across him, let's put it that way. He is sitting under a fig tree. Now, what does that mean? Sitting under a fig tree. Well, in the context in which John's explaining, so often that was, do you know, like today, when we sometimes have those lovely little pictures in our house, home sweet home. If you like, in Jesus' day, the symbol, if you like, for security, for home, for being where you want to be, was sitting under your own tree, generally a fig tree, because they were so abundant. And so often in Jewish literature, so often the religious leaders, the thinkers, were often spoken of as sitting under a fig tree, thinking, contemplating. And that's where Nathanael is. And the inference seems to be from Jesus that actually Nathanael is someone who is a thoughtful man who's sitting down, as it were, in what he recognises as his safe space. We love that phrase, don't we, at the moment? It's a very helpful one. His safe space for him would have been his own fig tree. He's sitting down and he is thinking and he's chewing over. What's he chewing over? Well, the inference tends to be, doesn't it? He's thinking about some big issues. He's thinking about, well, what does it mean? These Old Testament, we call them Old Testament scriptures that we've got, that God has done something in the past and God has made promises to do something now. You wonder if he was content under his fig tree. I'm sure he felt safe. Like all of us, don't we? That when we get home, when we lock the door, no matter what's going on outside, there's a sense in which in our own home, in the environment that we've made for ourselves, that there's a sense, quite rightly, a sense of security, a sense of contentment. But here's the thing. What Jesus intimates is sitting under his fig tree, that Nathanael, just like you and I, has a problem. And the problem is quite simply this, that Nathanael he's stuck. He's stuck within the confines of his own thinking and understanding. He is stuck within the reality of his own character. He's bound by the attitudes that he has developed. And probably like the rest of us, because he is alone in his thinking, there is things like incredible uncertainty. There are things like feeling a sense of isolation, about feeling a sense of vulnerability. Now, I want to say to you, here is a picture that so often represents us as human beings. No matter how far we go in life, no matter what we build around us, and we may have, and hey, you know, I'm very grateful to God, we may have a wonderful family, we may have lovely friends, but actually there are times when we find ourselves sitting under life's fig trees, our fig trees, and the sense of isolation, the sense of thinking, who are we? What am I doing here? What should I be doing? What should I expect from life? What am I kind of, what sort of things should I be thinking about? There's a sense in which it's, in one way, a safe place, but it's the loneliest place. You see, where we find Nathanael is this. We find Nathanael, like every single one of us, living in God's world, in God's time, by God's grace, with a broken relationship. A broken relationship that so often manifests by that sense of feeling alone. That sense of looking out on the world and trying to make sense of it and our place in the world and thinking, I just can't find the answer. I read in the paper earlier on this week that they're saying there's a growing epidemic amongst our young people. An epidemic of trying to find out who they are. What's their place in the world? I think that's incredibly sad. And I think us, as an older generation, have got to take a long look at ourselves, because there's clearly things that we've done that we should have. There's things we've done that we should have done, and things we've not done that we should have. No, get it right. We've made a mistake in our words. Sorry, let's get it right. What I'm saying is there is a relationship between these generations. But that being said, it's understandable, because it's just another sad manifestation of what we're coming across here. That there is no place so lonely in the world in which we live as it suddenly comes to us, our sense of being alone. That is not to do with the fact that we perhaps are unsure about our person or about our abilities or about our place in the world. It's not due to the fact that we might be alone simply perhaps because we don't have what we feel are real friends or even sometimes tragically because it's a family. No. It's highlighted something about the tragedy of what has happened to this world and to the people, the race, the human race that God has made. We're separate from the God to whom we should know. At the heart of the great Protestant faith, it's summed up in many ways by that wonderful question of the Westminster Catechism. What is the chief end of man? Do you know, that's not it though, is it? To glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Notice that? Both are to do with relationship. And my question this morning is to you and I, are you still sitting under your fig tree without a true relationship with the great God who is longing to have you as his own? Because life will never make sense. You and I will never find satisfaction until that relationship is actually brought together. And here's the interesting thing. I said that's interesting. Do you notice that when Philip says to Nathanael, come and meet this guy, Jesus. He says, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. That's all he says. Now, if you know the story of the Gospels, there's a sense in which Nathanael is being given incomplete, inadequate information. In one sense, he is having misrepresented to him Jesus. Because Jesus was never known as Jesus of Nazareth by his friends, by those who understood where he came from. So often it was kind of a way in which to pour scorn on him. That's exactly what Nathanael does. He says, look, can anything good come out of Nazareth? It's a bit of a dead-end town. I've got to be very careful here. I don't know, where would you... I'll leave you to answer this. Where would you say in Swansea is the sort of place you say, well, I wouldn't want to come from there? Where I grew up in London is where I lived, actually. People say, I wouldn't want to live in Brixton. That's where I came from. But anyway... It's interesting, isn't it, that even with a misrepresentation of information that Philip sincerely gives to Nathanael, something wonderful is about to happen. And it may be here this morning that you are someone who's sitting here and you're thinking, well, do you know what? I know something about Jesus. I know something about the stories of Jesus, and I'm sure you do. But it's whether you have a proper, clear understanding. That's the truth about him. Because the world in which we live, even so often sadly amongst Christians, we don't actually portray Jesus truly as he is. So what changes? What changes for Nathanael? Nathanael, who is somewhat cynical about this invitation. Nathanael, perhaps, who may have had genuine doubts. Who is this Jesus? Why is it so important that I come and meet him? Because Nathanael here, just like you and I, is living out that prophetic tragedy that God said would happen when Jesus came into the world. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the clearest testimonies to Jesus and what he would do is found in the book of Isaiah and in chapter 53, where there is a graphic description of Jesus' person, his life, and his death. You can't help but read it, and remember it's written some several hundred years earlier, reflect how accurate it is a description of Jesus. And yet it begins like this: Lord, who has believed our report? Who's believed it? And then it goes on to say, as we thought about him or we looked at him, there was nothing about him, there was no beauty in him that we should desire him. And here's poor Nathanael. You can understand, in one sense, his cynicism, his kind of doubt. But actually, he does something very, very sensible. He listens and takes up the invitation. Come and see, says Philip. And so Nathanael comes. So secondly, what changes? What changes? 3 things notice, okay? He comes to Jesus, and this is how it comes down. It says, when Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said to him, "Here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false." Here's the first thing. Jesus, notice, makes a generous and loving assessment of Nathanael's character. He actually says, there is, in this fella coming towards me, there's nothing false. Some of you might have the word deceit, or the older old-fashioned word, there's no guile in him. It's an interesting word. It's a word that originally was used to talk about the bait that was put on a hook to catch fish. Think about that. Those poor little worms, or those, I'm not a fisherman, or those flies, you put those poor little worms on, and the whole point of them, of course, is they attract the fish, but they don't see the hook. And Jesus is saying, here is a man who is without duplicitous motives. He's willing to examine for himself the claims and the invitation that he has been given. In other words, Jesus recognizes something of sincerity in Nathanael's character. And what Jesus is doing, of course, is what he always does as he deals with individuals. He knows us, as I'll come to that. But he recognizes the good in us, as well as the bad. Now, don't misunderstand that. What I'm trying to say to you is, it seems to me what Jesus is doing here, he is valuing Nathanael's character. Do you get that? He is valuing Nathanael's character, knowing full well that this man's got a great deal of cynicism still within him. And I just think, well, isn't it refreshing, surely, to find someone who values us for who we are, who values us for what we are? And the great truth, of course, that we Christians need to keep saying to people out there who doubt this is that this Jesus values people. He cares for people. He assesses us and knows us, and he cares for us. He does not dismiss us. Do you know, I got a friend in Nepal who came to faith, and I can remember him sharing with me his fear before he became a Christian. Because the gods that he worshipped were absolutely insistent. They would not accept him because of who he was. And they expected from him all manner of kind of acts or money to give in order to find acceptance. The world hasn't changed much. Your friends at school, they want you to be part of the group. You've got to earn their acceptance. Your colleagues at work, it's the same. Here is a man who is showing to Nathanael, hey, do you know what? I value who you are. I recognize even within you certain things that are right and good. There are things that aren't so right and good, but I recognize it. He values Nathanael for who he is. We have to say, in terms of the historic context, it would appear, and I don't want to go into this because it's going to sidetrack me, but Jesus appears to be identifying Nathanael as a devout Jew, as what we might want to call a God-fearer, a man who recognizes there is a God and a God who he has to listen to and deal with, but as yet he's not found Jesus. But the point is, he's valuing who he is. That's the first thing. And you and I need to know this morning that there is only one Jesus. And that one Jesus is a Jesus who values us for who we are. And the proof of the pudding is that he willingly took up the Father's call to give himself to die on a cross, to reconcile us and bring us into a relationship with God. But there's a second thing. Because the conversation then turns, doesn't it, quite intriguingly. Nathanael comes and Jesus says, here's an Israelite in whom there is nothing false. So Nathanael's quite says, well, how do you know me? Jesus, I've never met you. I have no idea who you are. As far as I'm concerned, you're just Jesus of Nazareth. In fact, he wasn't. How do you know me? And Jesus then says, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you. Now, there's one way to look at that. You could say, well, it's pretty obvious. Jesus, we know, was someone who was constantly walking around the towns and cities and villages. It's probably he walked just past and saw Nathanael. That's one way to look at it. But the text doesn't allow you to do that, does it? Because Jesus' words, and more importantly, that wasn't me, was it? Nathanael's response doesn't allow you to accept that. Look what happens. How do you know me? I saw you while you were still under the fig tree. Nathanael declares, Rabbi, teacher, you are the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. That's quite a response, isn't it? You could say, well, isn't it a bit hyperbolic? But what's taken him aback is suddenly his awareness of what Jesus is actually saying. Nathanael, I saw you. Not that I saw you with the physical eyes that I possess, but Nathanael, I know you. I know who you are. I know what you were doing under the fig tree. I'm aware of your feelings and your sentiments and the way you're feeling so alone and so isolated. I know who you are. In other words, what we've got here is one of those wonderful examples of the supernatural knowledge that Jesus Christ possessed as a human being that shows that he was more than simply a human being. Here is the God-man using his all-powerful knowledge and understanding. His omniscience is the theological word, his knowledge. Nathanael, I saw you and I know you. Now we need to take that up, don't we? Because the one thing that the Bible insists about this great God who exists is that he is not only all-powerful, he is all-knowing. It's put most beautifully in terms of the Bible's teaching in Psalm 139. Where the psalmist, David, is absolutely bowed down. Lord, he says, you know me, you know my rising up, you know my sitting down, you know absolutely everything about me. If I go to the very heights of heaven, you're there. If I go to the very depths of the sea, you're there. In other words, what Nathanael experiences was what the Christian experiences. And believe me, friend, first of all, it's so utterly disconcerting. But it becomes so comforting and so life-changing. Let me try and put it like this. Have you ever had, and you must have had, do you ever have one of those moments when you're either in the family or you're in a crowd of people and suddenly you realise that someone really knows you? You know those embarrassing moments when you suddenly realise that actually this person, I don't know, brother, sister, wife, colleague at work, they've said something that makes you realise, oh my goodness me, they know me. They know what I'm like. That can be quite disconcerting, can't it? How can you, if you magnified that by infinity? Nathanael, you see, is being brought to that moment where he has been showing that actually this God who has made us, who desires to shed his love upon us, he knows everything about us. He knows the thoughts we possess, the attitudes that we show and why we have them. He knows those secret innermost. He even knows not just those secret innermost things are. He even knows those things that we don't want to face up to about ourselves. That can be very unnerving, can't it? very perplexing, alarming. But you know, it goes further. Because it's in this gospel, John's gospel, which more than any other three tells us about the things that Jesus taught. Jesus shows the extent of his divine knowledge of every human being. Let me just trace it out very quickly. It comes across in the very next chapter, where Jesus, as his popularity grows, people start to come to him and they want to follow him. They want to be part of what's going on. And John tells us that Jesus did not commit himself to them, and then comes in, because he knew what was in human beings. My friend, as you sit here this morning, or as I stand here this morning, there is not one fraction of my and your life, our understanding, our thinking, that God does not know or is aware of. And that's why when John goes on to tell Jesus' story, you get this incredible not a confession, is it, John? No, it's not. It's a statement of fact, that's better, that Jesus makes on several occasions. There's a group of religious men come to him, quite hostile, with hostile arguments. And Jesus says this, he says, don't you know I and the Father are one? And the proof of that is this, that the Father has committed to me all judgment. I have been given, this is John 5, I have been given all authority to execute judgment. And my judgment, says Jesus, is righteous. And later on he goes on, it says, I've come into this world for judgment. And it's interesting that the heart of the apostles' message, summed up by the Apostle Paul when he was speaking in Athens, the kind of almost the pinnacle of the world's kind of education and outlook. Paul says, look, don't you understand, he says, that God has appointed a day in which he will judge the world by one man, Jesus. You see, you and I stand here, sit here, shall I say, this morning, not just all-knowing, but all known by God, but actually we will face a God who with perfect knowledge and righteousness and justice will one day call you and I to an account for the life that we lived. There's nothing more difficult, is it, when you know you've done wrong and you're trying to give excuses to whoever it is you've offended, or you've done the wrong feed for, and you're trying as hard as you can to make all the right excuses. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You can't do that with God. You can't do that with Jesus. His love is such that he has to have and draw from you and I the absolute truth, and will lay you and I and say to you and I, how have you lived? What have you done? And he will know perfectly. But please notice there's a very important third thing here that happens. It's not just the way in which Jesus valued Nathanael. It's just not the way in which Jesus said to Nathanael, look, I know you. Notice thirdly, it's what I would call, there's a promise to Nathanael given of a new panorama, a new vision of life, if you like. Look at it, verse 50. Jesus says, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You shall see greater things than that." He then added, "I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." There's a very important kind of point we need to make first of all before we open that up about the gospel itself. You notice it says there, Jesus says, "I tell you the truth." And it's what we sometimes have as "verily, verily," or "truly, truly." "Amen, amen," says Jesus. 25 times in this gospel, when he's going to make profound statements, Jesus uses that by introduction. We'll look at it more next week. "Verily, verily, I say unto you, except you be born again," yes? And this is the first time it's used. In other words, Jesus is saying, "Nathaniel, I am about to say something to you that is profoundly important." What is it? Well, he takes Nathaniel back to a story that he knew really well. The story that Mike read to us this morning from Genesis 28. He takes Nathaniel back to the man who would see as a great forefather in the Jewish faith, Jacob. And Jacob's experience as he fled from home, and that night when he's under the stars, as it were, and he lies down on a stone and he dreams. And as he dreams, he sees this ladder going from earth to heaven, and the angels of God, the messengers of God, going up and down. In other words, he gets a beatific vision, the vision of God. And Jesus is drawing his attention to that. He says, "I tell you what, you will see greater things than that." How can I help bring that out? You probably most of you know, in the kindness of God, we spent the last couple of weeks with our son and his family in Seattle, in Washington State. Washington State, the great Northeast, is just an incredibly different place from what you and I know. You can imagine it 300 years ago, it was nothing but pine forests. Just pine forests everywhere. My son has kind of 700-foot pine trees in his garden, for crying out loud. And wherever you go, there's forestry, even with the development. And you get this wonderful experience because it's all built by the coast. There are times when you're walking through the forest, as it were, and you're surrounded by these huge, big fir trees. And suddenly you come down to the coast, to the shore, to the Puget Sound, and suddenly what opens up before you is this incredible view. It's just amazing. And it seems to me that there's a picture here of what Jesus is saying. Nathaniel, at the moment, you're thinking here, and you're thinking, how do I understand things? He says, "You know what? If you trust and follow me, I'm going to open up to you something that's so unbelievably amazing that you just wouldn't have thought it was possible." What is it? Well, it's going to be this if we follow the story, isn't it? It's going to be the depth of the love and commitment and perseverance that Jesus Christ would reveal to Nathaniel and to the others over the next 3 years. It's the depth of his commitment to them, not just as their teacher, but as their leader and as their saviour. It's the opening up to them that this incredible human being who lives such a perfectly sweet and wonderful life finally allows himself to go and to be taken and to be misjudged and to be abused and hung upon a cross. It's that moment when they would have seen him, this lovely one whom had done so much for them and others, hanging with the blood, as it were, pouring from his body. It would have been that moment when they saw all their hopes and aspirations seemingly shattered as he finally gave up and says, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And for 3 days, wondering where did it all go wrong. And then comes that moment as they're sat in the upper room where Jesus suddenly appears and says, peace. And to see him coming to them and teaching them over the next 40 days, and then to see him ascend back into heaven. In other words, these greater things are what Jesus had come to do for Nathanael and for all who would trust him. Just a little kind of insight here. Don't think I'm smart, because I'm not. You notice that Jesus says, I tell you the truth, you shall see. I tell you the truth. The Greek is plural. He's not saying, I tell you, Nathanael. What he's really saying is, I tell you, whoever is prepared to believe will see these greater things. Do you have this morning, my friend, no matter how weak or how feeble you think it is, do you have a living relationship with God that rests solely on not who you are or what you've done, but on Jesus? If you don't, and you're wondering, well, how? Do you know how hard it is? Well, listen to the words that were spoken to Nathanael when he, with all his doubt and his skepticism, said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip, very wisely, said, come and see. Come and see for yourself. Do you know the wonderful thing about Christianity that is so misunderstood at present time? Which, even in terms of those who rule us, our government, is so utterly misunderstood. It is this absolute misrepresentation and misunderstanding that you can force people to become Christians. That you can engage in what's derogatively called conversion therapy and make someone, against their own will, into a Christian. That is absolutely, that's a total misunderstanding of the Christian message. The Christian message always is, come and see. Listen, everyone who's thirsty, says the prophet Isaiah so many years ago. Everyone who's thirsty, come to the waters and drink. Listen to Jesus as he stood outside the temple. Whoever comes to me shall never thirst, shall never hunger. It's who comes to me. There is an invitation given out that you and I may take up freely. And like Nathanael, you know the blessings. Oh, we don't have to take it up. We can't force anybody. But what we can say is, like Philip was saying to Nathanael, even though he got it wrong, it's interesting, isn't it? Come and see for yourself. Come and taste. My wife's going to tell me off now afterwards, but I don't care. I'm going to finish with this. Taste and see that the Lord is good. One day, I'll take you all back to London, and I'll take you to, I've got a choice. I'll take you back to Westmoreland Road, and I'll take you in to the pie mash shop to eat the best of South London's cuisine. And you'll come in and you'll have a squashed, thrown on your plate, kind of mince pie that looked like it's been run over by a truck. And you'll have a dollop of mash that's got all the eyes in it still. And then you'll get this green liquid, like a parsley sauce really, but it's better, which is called liquor. And they'll put it on this plate, and if it's a good pie mash shop, the plate will probably be chipped. And you'll sit there and you'll smother it with salt and vinegar, and you will eat the best of the best. I hope you're thinking, you must be joking me. My response, taste and see. My friend, if you do not know Jesus this morning, this man who just met Nathaniel, if you've got all sorts of questions about your life, I urge you to make this commitment to yourself first and foremost. Lord Jesus, I want to find out about you. I want to know you. I want to know how much you know me and what you've done for me. Some of you here this morning, if your parents could, if your grandparents could, they would with every last ounce of their being, they would want to pull you into the Christian faith. But they can't do that. And they mustn't do that. But you know what they will do? Come and see. Come and taste and see how good God is. Come and see how wonderful this Jesus is and true to his word. Have you ever found anybody who would know absolutely everything about you and still want you? Jesus does.